Good morning. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining the Heart and Stroke Foundation's webinar, Cardiac Arrest, Fast Action Saves Lives. Heart and Stroke is leading the fight to beat cardiac arrest and transform resuscitations by finding solutions to save more lives. Hello, webinar guests, colleagues, and champions of heart health. Whether the sun graces your morning or afternoon, maybe even a little bit of snow, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. My name is Denise Bymack, Resuscitation Program Manager for Business Development and Engagement with Heart and Stroke. Today, I'm delighted to unveil and share strategic initiatives and stories aimed at combating cardiac arrest. But before we delve into this engaging discussion, please allow me to address a few housekeeping items first. So when you join today's webinar, you will be joined through computer audio. If you prefer to listen with your phone, simply select phone call or select call me and follow the prompts for more options. Questions are welcomed during today's webinar. Please feel free to enter them through the question panel, and they will be addressed during our question and answer period towards the end of the webinar. If we do not have enough time to answer all the questions live, we'll provide a summary of questions and answers in your follow-up email. This session will be recorded and made available at the end of the webinar and also provided in a follow-up email. Today, we would like to begin with acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that called this nation home. We're gathered today because of a shared commitment to equity, including health equity and reconciliation. I encourage you to reflect on what that means for you in your work and in your lives. Let's talk numbers. Heart and Stroke recently released their heart report for February's Heart Month called Every Second Counts, Transforming Resuscitation to Start More Hearts, which revealed a staggering statistic that approximately 60,000 cardiac arrests occur annually in Canada. One out-of-hospital cardiac arrest happens in Canada every 9 minutes, and only 1 in 10 survive an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. New data shows us that cardiac arrests are much higher than previously estimated. These numbers demand action, and it's our mission to transform resuscitation outcomes by empowering more bystanders with awareness and life-saving skills. Attendees of this webinar will learn valuable information about the current state and occurrence of cardiac arrest in Canada, deepen their understanding of what transpires in the heart during a cardiac arrest, and identify at-risk individuals, recognize potential symptoms that may indicate early cardiac arrest, feel confident in identifying out-of-hospital cardiac arrest situations, and know how to assist, support initiatives to enhance education, raise awareness, and increase the availability of automated external defibrillators, otherwise known as AEDs. And of course, we're hoping to spark interest in exploring further opportunities for learning more about CPR. We are very grateful and honored to have two very special guests with us today. They are passionate authorities on this topic, and we look forward to hearing from their personal and professional expertise. I'd like to first welcome Dr. Christian Vaillancourt, who is a full professor of emergency medicine with the University of Ottawa and also serves as a senior scientist with the Ottawa Hospital. Dr. Vaillancourt's research program focuses on pre-hospital care, specifically enhancing outcomes for cardiac arrest and trauma victims. Notably, he conducted a national survey on CPR training bearers and facilitators and contributed to improving cardiac arrest recognition and 911 telecommunication assisted CPR instructions. As the co-principal investigator and current chair of the Canadian Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, otherwise known as CANROC, he has garnered international and national acclaim, including a National Advocacy Award from the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians for leading and disseminating its national position on bystander CPR. Allow me to also introduce Katricia Gellis, who is the Partnerships Manager at Action First Aid and Safe Station Ambassador, who educates customers about life-saving AEDs and CPR and first aid training. Her personal experience surviving a cardiac arrest at the young age of 30 has fueled her passion for CPR instruction, setting cardiac arrest awareness, and advocating for bystander CPR, and of course, 24/7 public access to AEDs. Katricia is also a member of the Public Engagement Committee for the CANROC program and dedicated to improving survival rates for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Denise.
Yeah. So Dr. Valancourt and Katricia, they both have no conflicts of interest pertaining specifically to this webinar. Dr. Valancourt has received research grants from the Heart and Stroke and other funding agencies in support of a variety of cardiac arrest related projects. And as mentioned, Katricia is the founder of Living Proof CPR Training and a partnership manager at Action First Aid. Excellent. So, Dr. Valancourt, everyone is eager to dive into this topic of cardiac arrest that's both urgent and vital. Could you start us off, please, by clarifying for everyone, what is the definition of cardiac arrest and why does every second count in this life-saving conversation?
Yes, thank you very much for the generous introduction, Denise, and thank you all for joining, and to Heart and Stroke for the opportunity to engage with you today as well. So the biggest difference between heart attack and cardiac arrest is something that we need to address often with people in the media and in the general public or the population. There's often a misconception and not understanding the difference between both. So during a heart attack, people are still alive, they are awake, they have traditionally pressure in their chest, they feel shorter breaths, sometimes some nausea. And this is when a part of your heart muscle is dying from lack of oxygen. That's mostly a heart vessel problem or a plumbing issue, so to speak. And you may have heard as well that for heart attacks, there are some differences in symptoms often between men and women. Women do not always experience heart attacks, just like in the medical textbooks with the classical symptoms. So that's leading to differences in outcomes for men and women. Unfortunately, in cardiac arrest, men and women experience this very much the same. And a cardiac arrest is very different from a heart attack per se, in that essentially the victim is dead. They are unconscious. They are no longer breathing or breathing abnormally. And essentially at this time, their heart is stopped. It's either a worsening of a very bad heart attack, or most often it's also an electrical problem that can happen absolutely suddenly and without warning. So, I'll take you back memory lane a little bit, and Denise mentioned that our numbers are staggeringly high and higher than what we thought in the past. So we did publish the first national estimation of how many cardiac arrests there were 20 years ago, and our numbers at the time were, well, it's between 20 and 30,000. So if you look at what 30,000 victims looks like, it's imagine filling a large NHL hockey arena. That's how many cardiac arrests we thought there were in the country at the time. But our latest numbers would actually fill a stadium during the Super Bowl. So if you look at this entire stadium and you fill it with people, that's how many cardiac arrest victims there are each year in Canada. Why that is, and why is it that the numbers are so staggeringly higher? Well, you may have heard that the Canadian population is growing. Canadian population was 36 million 20 years ago. It's closer to 40 million now. So there are more of us living in the country, but also we're getting older. 20 years ago, the majority of Canadians were between 35 and 40 years old. Today, The majority of Canadians are closer to 60 and 65 years old. So it's not a big surprise that when there's more of us and we're getting older, there are naturally more cardiac arrest victims. But it's also because we have far better estimations of the scope of the problem. So thanks to heart and stroke support of CanRock, which was mentioned before, we now have much more precise estimations of the numbers of cardiac arrests that occur in the pre-hospital field each year in Canada. So CanRock is a cardiac arrest registry of cardiac arrest taking place in practically every province in the country. Again, if we try to understand a little bit better who are victims of cardiac arrest, these are statistics that have been showing for many years, but they're still relevant today. So of course, the typical victim of cardiac arrest is a slightly older man, but there are a lot of women, Katricia is proof of it, who are victim of cardiac arrest, and half of the cardiac arrest victims actually are younger than 65. So it's not just a disease. Oh, sorry, previous slide. The other thing as well is the majority of cardiac arrest happen at home. So although we will talk about public access defibrillators, the great majority of cardiac arrest will happen in someone's own house. That means that most likely it will be a family member. 40 to 50% of cardiac arrests are witnessed. That also tells us that unfortunately 50 to 60% of the time someone will fall victim of a cardiac arrest with nobody around to witness it. And most importantly, it's the first symptom of cardiac disease in half of the victims. So we've made a lot of efforts to decrease smoking, diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol. These are all risk factors leading to heart attacks and ultimately cardiac arrests. But in half of the victims, they didn't know they have any of these diseases. So we have to find ways as well to help those victims if we cannot prevent heart disease from progressing. The OPAL study is a study that took place in Ontario that was led by Dr. Steele, again, about 20 years ago. At the time, it was the largest pre-hospital cardiac arrest study in the world. And it helped us quantify the impact of each of the, next slide, please, each of the links in the chain of survival. So not surprisingly, everything to the right of the reddish line is something that helps you survive cardiac arrest. So not surprisingly, the younger you are, the more likely you are to survive. If you are witnessed, so if you have a cardiac arrest in the presence of someone who can help you, you are much likely to survive. But this was the first study to really quantify the impact of what you can all do, which is bystander CPR. And if you do immediate CPR before the ambulance arrives, you can increase survival by 2 to 3 times for a cardiac arrest victim. At the time of that study, there were no public access defibrillators. So the response time within 8 minutes, that meant really when the paramedics or the firefighters or the police officers arrived there with the defibrillators, what they had at the time, within 8 minutes, also increasing tremendously survival for cardiac arrest victims. What surprises people tremendously is the fancy drugs and tubes that they put to help people breathe, all the interventions that are advanced life support that are brought at the scene by paramedics, they don't really impact survival that greatly. Nothing makes a difference as much as bystander CPR and early defibrillation. Again, if we go back memory lane, the number of times that people were doing bystander CPR 20 years ago in Ontario were pretty dismal. Only 15% of the time, that's 1 time out of 8, when the paramedics arrived at the scene of a cardiac arrest, someone was actually doing CPR. We didn't quite understand why until we noticed that, next slide, please, the province of Ontario was also the last province in Canada to adopt 911 CPR instructions. So when we started to provide CPR instructions to 911 callers in April 2004, we finally met up with the rest of the country, and our bystander CPR rates improved at the time closer to 38 or 40%. I'm happy to report that nowadays it's 50%. So half the time when someone has a cardiac arrest in the presence of others, people are actually doing CPR. And we know we can do far better than that. Next slide, please. So we also know that there are barriers to initiating CPR. We know that often in the first minutes following cardiac arrest, The brain does not have enough oxygen to keep you conscious, so you pass out. But the brain stem, which controls the breathing, still make people take an occasional gasp or an occasional breath. That's called agonal breathing. Next slide. And we know that this trumps both the 911 communication officers as well as the people who call 911, because remember, most cardiac arrest victims will be a family member. So people don't want to recognize that their loved ones are in cardiac arrest, and they will cling to any signs of life, including an occasional abnormal breath. So we've done a lot of studies supported with by the Heart and Stroke to try to understand this phenomenon. Next slide. And we've developed an educational tool for our 911 communication officers, which was very successful in helping them to recognize cardiac arrest when it's there, even in the presence of agonal breathing. It improved bystander CPR rates and improved survival. And we're glad to report that, next slide, we have implemented this educational tool now across 5 provinces in Canada, and we are in the process of implementing this intervention, which we hope will save many more lives in the country. Very briefly, what's in the future, we're also engaging with IBM Watson. You may know that this was the first machine learning or artificial intelligence that beat the chess champion at its own game, and also won everything at Jeopardy. And we are engaging with IBM Watson to further improve and enhance the performance of our 911 communication officers. I've also mentioned that unfortunately 60% of cardiac arrest happened unwitnessed, not in the presence of anybody. So Dr. Gruno, a colleague in Vancouver, is working on developing wearables, smartwatches like many of us have, or smart speakers in the house that could actually recognize absence of vital signs and call 911 even in the absence of a bystander, so that we can get help and actually perhaps improve the survival for these victims. I want to go back to CanRock and our public engagement committee, as mentioned by Denise. So it's chaired by Dr. Katie Dainty and Matthew Church, who's also a survivor. We have, next slide, many additional survivors, of which Katricia Gillis is part of, and she's going to speak about her experience next. And I wanted to mention as well, we're really proud of our cardiac arrest survivors, because they are actually leading our priority setting within the organization to let us know where they want us to study next, and where they want us to go to further improve survival for cardiac arrest victims. So that's it for me, and I think it's a good segue to let Patricia talk to you about her experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Valancourt. That was wonderful. It's great to see how we can recognize where there's been a need for research and improvements, and it's great to see what's coming in the future. So thank you for that. So let's welcome Katricia. Your story is a beacon of hope, illuminating the reality that cardiac arrest does not discriminate by age or time. So can you please share with us your brave journey and personal triumph over sudden cardiac arrest?
Sure. Thank you so much, Denise. And thank you to Heart and Stroke Foundation for inviting me here today. I'm always happy to share my story when I feel that it can really make a difference and help people really understand the importance of what we're all trying to do here, which is share knowledge about how important it is to do CPR and to be able to use an AED and feel confident to react and recognize when someone needs your help. And so I'm happy to share a little bit about what happened to me. I was 30 years old when I had my cardiac arrest. So I had just celebrated my 30th birthday. I was in perfect health. There was really nothing wrong with me. And the story was told to me by the people that helped me, because I don't really remember anything that happened. I was eating lunch one day at my desk. I was working in Montreal at the time at a graphic design agency, and my 2 colleagues were with me, and they said that one moment I was awake and eating lunch and talking, and the next, within seconds, I lost consciousness very suddenly, and I was not breathing normally. So I was doing those agonal gasps that Dr. Vaillancourt told us about are key things that is the key thing that can happen in the first few minutes, especially after a sudden cardiac arrest. So my colleagues did everything that you're supposed to do, and they're the ones that really saved my life because of their quick actions. So they followed the 3 first really important steps of the chain of survival: call, push, shock. They called 911 right away. and they started doing chest compressions. So they started CPR. They were pushing the blood around my body to buy me time, essentially, keep my brain oxygenated and allow me to have a chance to survive. And unfortunately, there was no automated external defibrillator at the office where I was working. And I have something in common with many other survivors that you'll meet. All of us will usually tell you that we were in the right place at the right time, and that's why we survived. And that was the case for me. So I was at an office where about around the corner, about 2 minutes away, there was a team of firefighters who had just finished a 911 call. They got back into their truck and they told me when I met them later that within 15 seconds of being available, the call for me came to them. And so they literally had to drive by my office to go back to their fire station. They were able to arrive and apply an AED to my chest within less than 4 minutes. And so the AED was attached. It read my heart rhythm. It indicated that I was in cardiac arrest. My heart was not beating in a normal rhythm. It was in fibrillation, so it was just shaking. So combined with the CPR and 2 shocks with the defibrillator, they were able to stop the abnormal rhythm that my heart was in, and the CPR allowed the heart to remember how to start pumping normally, and they saved my life. And so that is, a story that I hope resonates with people to help you really understand that, my story could have been very different if the people I was with did not recognize I was in cardiac arrest, if they did not call 911, and if they did not start chest compressions, which really is the key here that bought me the time. And if I did not have the AED available within that crucial 4 minutes, then I may not have survived. And if I did, I may have survived with brain deficits or things that prevented me from living the life that I do today. And so I'm so grateful to all the people that were involved in rescuing me and being there for me. There were 2 women that I worked with, there were 4 firefighters, and there were 2 paramedics, all who followed the chain of survival and gave me the chance to continue living the life that I do today.
That's wonderful, Patricia. Thank you so much for sharing your story. We're so thrilled that it had such a great outcome. And I think if we take one of the things that you mentioned about the right time and the right place, and we want to make sure that that can happen for more people who experience cardiac arrest. Now, the 2 of you together have offered to have a wonderful discussion. And so we do have some questions we'd love to start with, and we can get a little bit more dive a little bit deeper into these vital topics, including CPR training and using AEDs. So maybe I'll go back to you first, Dr. Vaillancourt. Maybe could you explain to us the importance of quality CPR and AED use and how it can affect survival?
Well, thank you for the question, but I also want to maybe start my answer by saying you cannot do bad CPR, right? So quality, of course, is important. When you do something, you can always do it better, but it doesn't matter how long ago you've been trained, or if you've just seen it on TV and you have zero training. You have to know that doing anything at all, any CPR, is always going to be better than not doing anything at all. So it doesn't matter if you don't remember the exact sequence per se, if you think you may not pass your CPR exam or your course. Just put the hands on the chest, push hard, push fast. That's all you need to remember. Now, of course, we can take things to a higher level and improve the quality of what we do to push at the right rate, depth, and so on. But more and more, we have technology to remind us how to do this. So the defibrillators, for example, that the paramedics use will also give them that guidance. They will tell them to push harder or shallower, to push faster or slower as well. So the quality can certainly be enhanced by the technology that we have available as well. But the main message is not to be afraid to do it wrong. You cannot do it wrong. The biggest challenge I find, and I think this is something that the Heart and Stroke did a great job, and we'll talk about this later, is the realism of what to expect. Because when people take a CPR course, and I've taught a few people as well, it's very easy to tell people where to put their hands, to ask them to push on a mannequin. It's a very, very easy skill to learn. The biggest challenge to address is the psychological barrier to know exactly when to use these skills, to recognize that now is the time. that you are the person and that you are the best placed person to start to do CPR. And this is something that perhaps needs to be taught better in CPR classes, what to expect, the whole stress of the situation, and to really realize that it's not enough to just know the skills, you have to apply them.
Thank you. Such great advice, and taking from that, we realize that we can't hurt, we can only help. So that's great advice. Now, Katricia, you mentioned how vital it was that bystanders acted quickly. So can you walk us through maybe why it's so important to increase awareness around cardiac arrest and the need to recognize it, start CPR, and call for that AED and use it when it's available?
Yeah, thank you, Denise. I think that it's really important for people to be proactive about this and think about how they can prepare themselves to react in any emergency. And cardiac arrest is no different than, we do fire drills so that we are prepared if there's a fire. It's the same thing. We should be prepared to know what to do if we recognize somebody's in cardiac arrest. So I think the first thing is there's really only two things you need to look for that will indicate cardiac arrest. And it doesn't really matter for us as the bystander what the reason of cardiac arrest is, but what we do is never going to change. So if we see somebody that loses consciousness suddenly and is unresponsive and is not breathing normally. So if you breathe, breathing normally is just regular breaths in and out. If somebody is not doing that, if they're just taking a gasp every once in a while, that is considered cardiac arrest. We treat anything like that as a cardiac arrest, and we know there's just 3 steps that you need to take as the bystander. So call, push, shock. If you remember anything, just remember those 3 simple steps. Call 911 and ask somebody to get the AED. Push, so start CPR immediately. And as Dr. Van Cole said, you cannot hurt, you can only help someone. All you need to do is push one hand on top of the other, hard and fast in the center of the chest with your arms locked, and you'll be pushing the blood around the body and buying the person time. And as soon as the AED arrives, you have to turn it on, and all you need to do is listen to it. It's going to walk you through exactly what to do. You do not need to be trained. You don't need a license. You don't need a prescription. Anyone can use an AED and do CPR. And I think that the more that we can share that message with the public, that anyone can help, the power really to save someone's life is in the public's hands. We cannot afford to wait. We can't just call 911 and wait for first responders, because the key statistic that we know is that for every minute that goes by from the time a cardiac arrest happens, the chance of survival decreases by about 10%. So after 10 minutes, if nothing has been done, the chance of survival is pretty much 0. And from the research that we've seen, what we know is that within about 4 minutes, that is when brain damage is going to start to set in. So after 10 minutes, again, if nothing has been done, brain damage is irreversible. But we do have a small window where we can do chest compressions. And if we attach the AED within that 4 minutes, the chance of survival can be tripled, and there could be a real chance in saving someone. So that's why when we hear stories of survival, all of the survivors really have in common that it was witnessed, there was a bystander, somebody did CPR, and they had an AED attached. And it's usually the bystander that attaches the AED, or in the case of someone like Damar Hamlin, they had an emergency response plan in place. He had an AED attached within, under 2 minutes. So I think that's really the key takeaway here, is that bystanders have the power to save lives as long as we're prepared.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, maybe going even further to what you said, Katricia, and maybe touching back on what you said, Dr. Viancourt, is talking about how the addition of drugs and, being intubated and that advanced life support. And maybe let's walk back for people on this webinar and talk maybe specifically about those things, about why it's so important to start CPR quickly. Why is it that we're not waiting anymore, that we are intervening quickly, and how that's improving survival rates?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look historically, firstly, I want to agree wholeheartedly with everything that Katricia just said. I think that it's right on the money. To go back to survival, if we go back again 20 years ago, survival to cardiac arrest was only 3 to 5%. that means in their entire career, paramedics may have possibly never met a single survivor. Now we say 1 in 10. That's the overall survival across the board for all cardiac arrest victims. But if you can actually put all the right circumstances together, there's a witnessed arrest, someone is actually doing CPR, there's quick application of an AED, we can see survival as high as 50%, sometimes higher than this. So it's not even as grim as the statistics are in terms of survival. That's the overall picture. We can actually do far better than this. And we often hear survivors say that they were lucky. What we have to do is also work really, really hard at removing the luck out of all of this and improve our system. Some people would argue that this is our moral obligation as a society to be able to help our neighbors in these situations.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really good point. And I think I heard somebody say once, where you live shouldn't determine if you live. And so if we can spread this message far and wide, not just in Canada, not just in North America, but globally, I think that's going to really increase survival rates from cardiac arrest. Because again, we know that when people intervene, the chance of survival is really high. Because oftentimes it's not a heart attack that's causing a cardiac arrest. There's not anything wrong with the heart. It's an unfortunate electrical issue that causes the heart to malfunction, and the treatment is CPR to buy time, and then an AED normally needs to be used in the majority of cases to get the heart out of that abnormal rhythm. CPR alone sometimes can help, but often it's not enough to restart the heart. It's really the defibrillator that is the magic. I mean, it's science, but I think it's the magic touch that helps save people.
I wanted to share a couple of anecdotes about defibrillators. We teach nurses who respond to cardiac arrest inside the hospital to use defibrillators as well. And a colleague of mine was in the habit of putting the pads onto his own chest, alive, obviously, and was daring the nurses to turn the machine on. And some of them were afraid to do that. So I can only imagine how people in the community, many of them are afraid of actually using a defibrillator. But the comparison I use is I'm someone who's used defibrillators very often in my professional careers. I've also used booster cables to help with a dead car battery often. I'll be completely honest with you. I find it far more complicated to use booster cables, and I'm more scared for the battery exploding in my face than using a defibrillators. And something I've heard more recently, which is quite funny as well. So I've heard somebody say that the only way you can hurt someone with a defibrillator or an AED is to hit them over the head with it.
That's exactly right. You really cannot do any more harm than the person is already experienced, because this is their last hope. That's their last chance at survival. So you don't have to worry about what happens if you use it and it hurts them. It just won't hurt them. It will never shock if it does not need to do a shock. And that's why it's called an automated external defibrillator. It's not the same as you see a doctor use in a hospital with the paddles. They're controlling the shock and the amount of joules that it would give. But for the public, that's why we want to deploy as many automated external defibrillators as possible, because they are pretty much foolproof.
Yep.
Such great information. Now, I have one question that came in that's really relatable to this topic at this point, and then we'll maybe hop off and talk a little bit about what Heart and Stroke is doing, and then we can come back with a bunch of question and answers. So one person has asked that one major barrier that people experience when they go to start CPR is, I might break a rib and that might cause trouble. Am I in trouble? What would happen then? So that's causing them to hesitate in CPR. Maybe both of you could, maybe Dr. Vaillancourt, address the medical sense of that, and maybe Patricia, did that happen to you during your cardiac arrest?
I'll be a gentleman and let Patricia start. I don't know if Patricia had rib fractures, but I'm curious to hear now.
Sure, I'm happy to address that. So in my case, no, my ribs did not break, but yes, it's possible that depending on the person that is receiving CPR, their ribs could break. Other things could happen too. I mean, they could start foaming at the mouth, they could start bleeding, all kinds of things. This is like the most gruesome, awful situation that you're going to see. If you have to do CPR on someone, like, it's going to be not a pleasant experience to witness. But I think the key here is that it's better to be alive with broken ribs than dead with your ribs intact. So I think don't worry about breaking the ribs. it's okay. The goal is not to break the ribs. You're not trying to do that. You're just trying to push down about 2 inches, to the beat of staying alive. And as long as you're doing that, then you can think about what is my goal here. My goal is to imitate what the heart is not able to do normally. So my goal is to push down at a rate and a depth that is going to push blood in and out of the heart. And you really have to keep doing the CPR because the heart is really a pump. So, like you have to prime a pump. You can't just do a couple compressions and stop. You got to keep going. So as long as you're just pushing hard and fast on the chest, you're going to be buying the person time, and you're going to be helping more than you could ever hurt them.
Yeah. I would add, when we're talking about our ribs, we start to get old at the age of 35. So Katricia was still very
Hey.
You were young at the time of your cardiac arrest, Katricia, but of course, as we age, there's a cartilage part to our rib that becomes bonier and bonier with time. So of course, as we get older, the risk of breaking ribs is also increasing with time. But I'm going to quote a paramedic colleague here that say, if you haven't broken a few ribs, you're not doing a good job. So it's a possibly it's a sometimes a necessary complication of doing CPR. It does not always happen. It's common. You should not fear it. Like Katricia said so eloquently, I would much rather be alive with a few broken ribs. And also, to address the other concern, am I going to be in trouble? People need to know, if they don't already know by now, about the Good Samaritan law, where if you're trying to help someone in good faith, and when you're trying to really do your best to to save someone's life, no matter what happens, you will never be in trouble. You're protected by law, against any legal action if that were to be the case. That's true of doing CPR. That's true of using a defibrillator. As a matter of fact, there is a law in place where if you fail to help someone and someone actually knows that you've not helped someone in need, you could actually be in trouble by not helping. So that's quite the opposite of what most people think.
Great advice, yeah, for people to know that, because there are certain myths or barriers that are preventing people. So if we can demystify and clarify for everyone, that we'll have more bystanders helping out in the case of cardiac arrest. Yeah.
Can I just like to add something to that, if you don't mind?
Sure.
It's my understanding that in every province and in every state, there is some version of a Good Samaritan law in place. Now, the law is different from state to state and province to province, so you can definitely look it up what it is in your location. But it's just important to know somebody can try to, sue you or tell you you shouldn't have done that. But under the law, there's nothing that can happen to you. You're protected.
There's never been a single successful lawsuit for someone who tried to help someone in Canada.
Never.
Ever.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so important for everyone to hear that's concerned about that, because those are definitely some concerns that are out there. Yeah. So let's take a little shift. Let's talk a little bit more about what Heart and Stroke is doing right now to fight that battle against heart disease in Canada and actively champion initiatives to combat cardiac arrest. So right now, Heart and Stroke is committed to doubling the cardiac survival rate and increasing bystander CPR and AED use, as well as improving the outcomes for those impacted by cardiac arrest, including survivors, as Dr. Vaillancourt mentioned, lay responders, and for families. So we're dedicated to raising awareness through media and public campaigns like the Heart Month report that you'll be provided, whiteboard videos, which is the picture on the right there. So those are available and will be available at the end of this webinar, and hosting webinars such as these to elevate the importance of immediate intervention. And of course, the simple steps that you see throughout these videos, and recognizing those signs of cardiac arrest. We're also committed to educating generations of lifesavers. So that's a really big focus now with Heart and Stroke. In addition to all of our core training programs that we do offer by a national network of instructors, we have a new program. It's called Cardiac Crash, which is Heart and Stroke's new award-winning resuscitation program that introduces life-saving techniques in a fun and engaging and memorable way. So it's our short, fast-paced program that uses interactive, gamified, and true-to-life scenarios that teach foundational CPR and AED skills to workplaces and to schools. So that's the picture you see there on the left. So teams are going to compete for points by answering questions correctly and winning their group's hands-only CPR practice session. So the facilitator of cardiac crash monitors the quality of CPR and determines the winner of each session. So it's a really great way to introduce bystander CPR to your workplace or school. The cardiac crash workplace version features a woman experiencing cardiac arrest, which spotlights the reluctance of bystanders to step in and perform CPR, recognizing that every second counts. So a woman experiencing cardiac arrest in a public place is less likely to receive CPR than a man. So in Katricia's case, we're so grateful that your coworker stepped in so quickly, because there is that reluctance, and we're trying to make a change with that and our female victim in these scenarios. So Heart and Stroke is also advocating for change across the country, for government and education policies, funding, and regulations that support awareness, increase citizens trained in CPR, and improve AED access nationally with availability and awareness. So we're also utilizing data, as Dr. Valancourt and Katricia have mentioned, to improve our educational programs and encourage quality improvement in emergency response systems. Heart and Stroke proudly continues to represent as the guidelines-setting body for CPR, emergency cardiovascular care, and first aid across the entire country. So resuscitation excellence, Heart and Stroke's resuscitation training programs are considered the gold standard in Canada, ensuring optimal preparedness and response, training almost 500,000 people each year. So we're committed to enabling life-saving research and innovation by expanding our commitment and driving innovation in research science. Yeah. So it looks like we have some questions from our guests. Let me just see if I can pull those up in our chat here. Let's
There
see.
was one question I saw that I don't mind answering, if that's okay.
Good. Yes, thank you.
There's actually two questions, which I'm equipped to answer, and Dr. Valancourt can correct me if there's anything to add. But one was, what is the correct hand placement when you are doing chest compression? So I'm a CPR instructor certified with Heart and Stroke Foundation. I've been teaching for a few years, and one of the easiest ways that I've learned to do a landmark is on adults. Pretty much what you want to do is, we have this bone here. We have this this bone, and we have our rib cage, and the heart is really positioned like in the center of the chest, kind of tilted left. So we really want to be chest pressing in the center of the chest to compress the heart. So the easiest way is just, if you take your hands and put them on the side of your body or on someone else's body and pull up to the armpits when they can't go any further, and then make a line to the center. That's really where you want to be pressing, and you want to just take your palm and line it up with that bone and put the other hand on top. So pretty much like this, and so hard and fast in the center of the chest. I don't know if there's anything to add to that, but hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. No, the only thing I would add is, of course, we've mentioned these are the basic skills that everybody should know. If you wanted to know, we did mention that we can improve CPR quality. The fancy things that we've started to do in the hospital when people are doing CPR is, we also put a big tube down their mouth, which has an ultrasound at the end, and we put this right next to their heart, right underneath it, so we can actually really micromanage the exact position of the hand placement. What you've explained is excellent, Katricia. What we do is sometimes we'll move up or down a centimeter or two to maximize the flow in the heart as well. So those are some of the fancier ways that we can improve basic CPR inside the hospital, but this is the right way to do it.
And for children, and some people, sometimes just drawing a line to the center of the nipples to the chest is a good way to do it for children. But for adults, usually just side of the chest and pull through. The other question I saw was related to, having a pacemaker or an internal defibrillator, and does that affect how a bystander would treat someone? And so my understanding, I mean, I have an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, so I have a scar here. It is not a pacemaker. It's the same. It looks the same, but it's a device that will give me a shock if my heart stops again. A pacemaker, you'll have the same kind of scar, same looking device, but it will actually pace the heart out of maybe a slower rhythm, for example. But regardless of if it's a pacemaker or an internal defibrillator, if somebody has one, you are absolutely still able to do chest compressions on them. That does not prevent you from doing that. And you can absolutely use an AED on them if needed. In my case, my family knows that my device is supposed to shock me. So I likely wouldn't need a defibrillator to be used. But if for some reason the device malfunctioned, then they could absolutely use one on me. And there's nothing that's going to harm me from doing that. So hopefully that answers both those questions.
I like that you also spoke to your family about this, Katricia. This is also something that everybody should do as well, right? In terms of their expectations. And do you know how to do CPR? Like, these are conversations we should have with our partners. If you want them to help you.
My husband and my family are probably among the most qualified CPR bystanders in the country. So
Yeah. So, can you maybe talk about, are there any risks to the person who is actually doing CPR on someone? Maybe speak to, transmission, or, the fact that COVID has been so prevalent in our lives. Is there any risk if you were to start CPR on someone?
So I would say overwhelmingly the answer to the question is no. Of course, if you think historically, at one point there was polio, and then this was concerned on occasion with meningitis, and COVID was not the first, and it will unfortunately not be the last pandemic. And I believe the Heart and Stroke did show some leadership during the COVID pandemic, making some recommendations to put a cloth on top of the patient's face during cardiac arrest, during chest compressions. During the pandemic, it was a difficult time for everybody. Of course, unfortunately, there were slightly more cardiac arrests. Sometimes they were less likely to be witnessed because more of them happened inside the house, not as many in public places where, for many of us, we were not allowed to go during the pandemic. So there's circumstances that change a little bit over time. And of course, in the hospital, even now, all the healthcare professionals are wearing masks and gowns and gloves during CPR. But overwhelmingly, the risk of transmission is next to none, especially because nowadays, especially for members of the public, we don't necessarily insist on mouth-to-mouth anymore, right? So chest compression only is absolutely good enough for people to help in a community. We used to teach that mouth-to-mouth was essential and an integral part of CPR. You don't absolutely need to do mouth-to-mouth anymore. And even with mouth-to-mouth, arguably, the risk of communicable diseases and transmission was already extremely low, of course, outside of a pandemic. But we don't even need to do mouth-to-mouth anymore. So the chance of catching a disease by putting your hand on someone's chest or using a defibrillator is next to none.
That is such great information to know how we've made changes to CPR and to recommendations of that it's not essential for someone to survive to do those breaths, that hands-only CPR is safe, it's effective, and it's an easy thing to learn. So that's definitely great advice. Now, Katricia, you did talk about how easy it is to use an AED and following those prompts. Now, how would someone know where they would have to put the pads on someone's chest? Can you maybe talk about what the AED does to help you use it correctly?
Sure, that's a great question. So there's different models and makes of AEDs on the market, just like there's different, cars or other kinds of technical things like your phone, for example. But at the end of the day, they all pretty much are meant to do the same thing and they work the same way. So you would just press the button to turn it on or open the cover to turn it on, and the AED is going to talk to you. Some AEDs will have a separate set of pads that are meant to be used on children. Typically, the manufacturers say that child under 8 years old is going to need a separate set of child pads that would deliver a lower shock. Some devices have a button that you would press that would switch it from adult to child mode. But regardless, it's okay to use an AED on anyone, even if you're not sure which pads to use. So that's okay. But just bringing, to come back to your question, the reason I mentioned that is because if it's an adult and it's adult pads, typically on the pads itself and sometimes on the AED or on the screen of the AED, it will tell you where to put the pads. And so for an adult, you're going to be putting one at the top right of the chest and the other at the bottom left. And so what's going to actually happen is when you press the shock button or when the AED shocks itself, it's going to deliver a shock straight through the heart. And it's going to allow the heart to stop the abnormal rhythm and restart. For child pads, you typically would put them in the same place because they will be smaller, but some AEDs will direct you, if the pads are bigger, you'll put one on the front and one at the back of the child. So it's really important. At the end of the day, the most important thing is to listen to the AED and look at the instructions on that AED, because that's what's going to guide you to what to do. And taking some kind of a CPR, whether it's a certification or doing a workshop or even something as simple as watching the videos, or cardiac crash, which is amazing, especially for children in schools to learn quickly, will help you to be prepared to know what to do, specifically when it comes to where you place the pads. So hopefully that helps.
I don't have a So I don't have a great view of all the questions. I can just see some of them flash by, and there was a great question about what were our views about home AEDs. I did mention the work of Dr. Gruno that I think will be pivotal if it's successful in helping us identify cardiac arrest when people are alone and not in the presence of someone. But we also cannot just keep AEDs for public access. We've mentioned the statistics are that 15% only of cardiac arrest occur in a public arena. The great majority of people have their cardiac arrest at home. So of course, unless we have a way to bring an AED very quickly into the space of people's houses, that also would be a major change in our ability to use AEDs. Now, there's a registry in place. There's one in Manitoba. There's one that's being worked in Ontario. So when you call 911, even from your own home, they will be able soon to tell you, if it's not already the case, where the closest AED is. There are new approaches as well with community bystanders that will. Some of them might be your neighbors, and they might be able to respond to your house very quickly with an AED. I bought a secondhand one that was cheap, so I have one in the gym at home over here. But I think another thing that needs to happen as well is we need to have big chain stores start to sell AEDs, just affordable ones right next to fire extinguisher. That should be no different. Mm-hmm. When they become affordable, they're easy to use. We should all have one, or at least one nearby.
At the end of the day, I just like to add to that is that, the cost of an AED, for example, at Costco, you can get an AED for about, $1,500. And I understand that is definitely an investment and it is a large sum of money, but people pay insurance for their cars. They pay home insurance. We pay fire insurance. And if you think of it as a kind of insurance, it really, if you divide it up over the course of the lifespan of the AED, it's, maybe a few dollars every month. And I really think that when we will see big change when a combination of things happen. So people knowing how to do CPR and feeling confident to react, having registries in every single province. Right now, Manitoba is the only province that has a registry. Ontario has a law, but it has to be enforced, and Quebec hopefully will be next. When we have registries that will direct people to AEDs, that's going to help. The advancements in technology, like Dr. Vancourt was talking about, that are going to help, including advancements in technology for AED technology. Having AEDs that are connected, for example, that would tell somebody there's someone having a cardiac arrest nearby, take this AED, bring it to them. Personal AEDs, like you said, that are at a much lower price point that you carry in your purse, and public access AEDs everywhere that are not just placed, but that are ready for rescue. So that means that we need to make sure that if you have an AED, you are maintaining it according to the manufacturer's guidelines. So all AEDs need to have a battery that's working and pads that are not expired. And so typically that's between 2 to 5 years that you'd replace those items. But if you have an AED at your office or your home, I would urge you to make sure you make a plan for taking care of that AED and keeping it ready for rescue, because there's no point in having an AED if it's not going to be ready for rescue when you need it.
Agreed. Thank you for that. So we're nearing the end of our webinar. I know there's been a lot of questions that have popped up in the chat and in the question and answer period. And so any of those that we've not had an opportunity to address live, we will take all of your questions and answer them, and then also provide that to you within a link in your email that will come after this webinar. So if I was to give you, Dr. Vaillancourt and Katricia, for people on this webinar, when they leave today, before they even get an opportunity to take some CPR training and AED use training, what would be your best advice for them after leaving today? How can they advocate, and how can they ensure we have improved outcomes from cardiac arrest?
So a cardiac arrest victim is not likely to be a stranger. If it is something that you ever encounter once in your life, it will be, unfortunately, a family member or a partner or a spouse. So the biggest challenge I see is the psychological barrier to start CPR. Otherwise, my biggest message would be, trained or not, trained is better. Do CPR if you need to. It's easy to pump on the chest, like Katricia explained. AEDs are absolutely easy and safe to use. It needs to become second nature for people, and not something that we fear doing or that we hesitate to do.
And to you, Katricia?
I would say that knowledge is power, and the key to this. So being proactive about it, being prepared, talking to your friends and family, sharing what you learned on this webinar, watching a video about how to do CPR and how to use an AED. There's many quick videos online that you can find. There's 2 right there that are on the screen now. Learn CPR in less than 90 seconds and learn how to use an AED in less than 90 seconds. Just something as simple as that will show you how to recognize cardiac arrest and then what to do and how to react. So I think that just being proactive about this is really going to be the key. So number 1, proactivity, and number 2, sharing this message with as many people as possible.
Great advice. That's wonderful. And as it says on the screen, please feel free to share these valuable resources. If you want to send an email to your family and friends and say, you know what I learned today, or think about that in, in Christmas cards, say, don't forget, these are really important things for everyone to know. So on to our next slide, just a quick reminder that a recording of this webinar will be uploaded and available on these websites. And then after today's webinar, a webinar evaluation will be sent to all of you by email, inviting you to complete a quick evaluation. And that will also lead you to a certificate of participation for this webinar. As well, please feel free to share and advocate to beat cardiac arrest on the following media platforms. So if you're comfortable and familiar with those, please share. That's always helpful to raise awareness. And now we're at the end. So on behalf of the Heart and Stroke Foundation, I want to extend a heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed presenters, Dr. Vaillancourt and to Katricia. Your insights and expertise have been truly invaluable, and to each participant that was on the webinar today who dedicated their time and will contribute to the collective understanding and awareness of cardiac arrest in Canada. Your engagement is just not appreciated. It's truly essential for us to make a change. So thank you again to everyone. Any closing remarks? I think we have maybe 1 minute left to our presenters.
I'd love to just share some final information. To anyone who's watching here, I'm imagining many of you have been affected by cardiac arrest in some way. Either you're a survivor or you're a co-survivor and you witness someone you care about have a cardiac arrest, or you're a responder and you've responded to it, or you're someone who might have lost someone from cardiac arrest. Whoever you are and however you're affected, I just want you to know that you are not alone in this. There is a lot of work being done right now to support anyone affected by cardiac arrest in different capacities. One of the links that was up there was something called HeartSight. And so I would encourage everybody to check out our HeartSight. It is a resource that I was asked to work on with a great group of people, and we have created a resource that I wish I had after my cardiac arrest of information for those of you who feel lost when you've been affected by this. And I'm really hoping that it's helpful for people. If anyone wants to reach out to me, you're more than welcome to. I'm always happy to connect with anyone to make sure you don't feel alone in this.
So kind. Great. Anything to add, Dr. Weincourt, before we say goodbye for the day?
I want these last thoughts to be our last ones. This is a great, and we have to pay more attention to survivors and their families and those who have lost. Katricia said it best.
Agreed. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you both for your time and your presentation today. Truly appreciated. So take care, everyone. Thank you, and have a great, wonderful, safe day. Bye.
Thank you so much.